In this video, we're going to talk about the different types of discrimination that are seen in professional sports. The first type is what is known as employer discrimination. Consider, for example, the European hockey players in the NHL, the National Hockey League. Now, although European-born players have played in the NHL since its inception in 1917, no player trained in Europe, no player that trained in Europe played in the NHL until the mid-1960s. As recently as the 2000s, some teams avoided European players altogether. Now, a lot of researchers out there have asked the question about whether European players have been victims of discrimination by the NHL, especially the Canadian teams. So, if this were to be the case, employers might prefer not to associate with quote-unquote foreign players. All right, so these teams should be choosing not to associate with these foreign players. So let's assume, let's go back here. Let's assume for simplicity that there are two groups of players. So we have North America. All right, so NA, so you have the demand for North American players, okay? And then you have European players, which is denoted by E. So demand for North American, demand for European. Okay. So also assume that, just for simplicity, that all players are equally as efficient at playing hockey. So their productivity levels are the same. In the absence of discrimination, the demand for the two types of players would be equal to each other, okay, which is shown in this right figure here. Right. So Becker, who is a researcher who wrote papers on discrimination, he measured the distaste that owners have for Europeans with the discrimination coefficient of DE. Okay, so DE is the discrimination of European players. Now, if that discrimination is greater than 0, if the owner feels that he, as the owner, pays some emotional cost in addition to the wage he pays a European. All right. So when that happens, the amount that's actually being paid to Europeans, both in monetary and non-monetary values, is going to be greater because of that discrimination coefficient. So when that happens, if NHL owners have a taste for discrimination and prefer hiring North American players to hiring Europeans, then what happens is the demand for North American players, DNA, right, is greater than for Europeans. So you can see the case here. So again, this is assuming that the players are the same, and it's the only difference in the demand comes down to this discrimination. Right? So what ends up happening is, because when there's employer discrimination, what you have is you have more players from North America and a higher wage being paid to them than European players. Okay. So again, this is employer discrimination. The second type of discrimination is statistical discrimination. Now, this differs from ordinary discrimination because it's really based on incomplete information as opposed to preferences of people who have full information. And this can have strong impacts on a team's hiring practices. Now, statistical discrimination can be problemsome for two big reasons. The one is that it actually may be profit maximizing behavior on the part of the firms. Right? So even though firms may be assuming that, all right, so let's go back to the European versus North American. And let's say that on average, North American players are of better skill than European. Right? So even though, if you're assuming that that's the case, It's not accurate with each individual player, but from a profit maximization standpoint, it may be the correct way to go because you are more likely to get a higher skilled North American player than a European player. All right. So when this is the case, the owners may feel justified. The second problem with statistical discrimination is that it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if offensive-minded European forwards are drafted and defensive-minded ones are not, over time, the league statistics will reflect the fact that Europeans are offensive-minded. All right. So, if you have offense and defense in hockey. If teams are only bringing over offensive European players, right, and not defensive one, what's going to happen again over time is that a majority of the players who are in the NHL are offensive players, and that can be used to further this statistical discrimination. And so it will, in essence, be creating the situation where you have these differences, even if they don't exist. So, going back to Becker, his theory implies that less discrimination with employers with less discrimination will be more successful than those with a lot of discrimination. Although professional sports, as we've talked about many times, are not perfectly competitive or anywhere near perfectly competitive, the pressure to win games and championships is a powerful motivation for owners to overcome their prejudices. And looking at baseball history, this can be shown by the teams that integrated black players into Major League Baseball first tended to be more successful than teams who integrated later. So, but what if the markets are not competitive? So, unlike perfectly competitive firms, discriminatory monopsonies are not driven from the market, since the workers can't sell their services elsewhere. So when the market power of a monopolist or monopsonist breaks down the ability to discriminate, when the monopoly power or monopsony power breaks down, so does the firm's ability to discriminate and still be profitable. Now, because professional sports leagues do have this power, they are free to discriminate as much as they want, which is why you have seen not as much now, although it is still occurring, but not as much now as it did before. Okay, so for these teams and franchises, leagues, were able to successfully discriminate for decades without any significant repercussions, because they were not competing with other leagues as much. The next type of discrimination is employee discrimination. So instead of the employer, the actual employees can cause discrimination. And employees with a taste for discrimination against their coworkers will regard a market with discrimination when that comes into play. And so baseball is a good example of this. During the first season, Larry Doby and Jackie Robinson were suggested to employee discrimination by players on opposing teams as well as their own teammates. Okay, so players around the league, managers, and even their own teammates were shown discriminatory behavior towards them. All right. When Larry Doby was introduced to his new team, a lot of the players refused to shake hands with him. All right. And this was a pretty big problem. It made integration more difficult because the other teams' owners could see how these players were being treated, and they could worry about how it would become a distraction in their clubhouse. All right. Now, over time, this eventually weighted as these discrimination, at least within the teams, became less, and these players who were integrated in from other leagues were becoming more widely accepted, but it took time. Consumer discrimination, another type. So consumers can have a taste for discrimination if they will not purchase goods or services from members of a specific group. A football fan with a taste for discrimination against black players may see the price of admission to a game with only white players to be one price, but isn't willing to pay as much of a price to see a game with a team that has white and black players. Now, consumer discrimination, especially in sports, can be difficult to isolate because there are so many factors that affect consumer demand. And market forces, unlike with employer and employee discrimination, market forces don't necessarily eliminate consumer discrimination over time. Another form of discrimination is positional discrimination or hiring. So even if professional sports leagues all offer equal access, they might not allow minorities equal access to all positions. So for example, in the NFL, about 2/3 of the players are black, and so if you think about, if that applied to coaching, you would think that 2/3 of coaches were also black, but it's not the case. It's nowhere near the case. And then that's on a hiring with coaching. On a player, historically, there's also been positional discrimination, and this has been occurring in both Major League Baseball and the NFL in particular. And what happens is you have certain races being predominantly represented in certain positions. For example, a lot of wide receivers and running backs tend to be black, and you tend to see more of a mix with a lot of other positions, but then you have quarterbacks, although it has been changing over time, but quarterbacks have historically tended to be more white than black. All right. And so this is, a problem that may be, again, we talk about self-fulfilling prophecies, but if, starting in Pee Wee League to high school and so college, players may see that, oh, okay, well, if I really want to make it, I need to look at this position. And so, for example, I believe as of 2017, I'm not sure what it is now, I think about 80% of the NFL starting quarterbacks were white. Right? So if you have a very athletic black player who is in high school, he may look at that, even though he can throw really well, and say, well, look, it's very difficult for black quarterbacks to make it in the NFL, potentially because, in large part, because of discrimination. And so that player may adjust their position to conform to that. At the same time, a white player who is a good wide receiver may say, there's a pretty strong belief in the NFL, it seems, that white players tend to not do as well at wide receiver, so maybe I should switch to a different position. So it just talks about the self-fulfilling prophecy potential with that. So that's just a brief overview of the different types of discrimination in professional sports.